As you would be aware, world dairy supplies and prices may be influenced by world stocks, particularly those held by the EU and the US. Over the last year, stocks in the EU and the US have decreased across all major commodity products. And in the case of skim milk powder and butter, these stocks have declined to negligible levels. The present stocks are higher than around the time of the commodities price spike in 2008, when they dropped to almost zero, but much lower than in 2004, when world dairy prices were generally much lower. A useful way to summarise the dynamics of a market in a single picture for a commodity for which stocks may be held is to look at how stocks as a proportion of consumption is tracking compared with price. The slide on the screen shows this for skim milk powder since 2001. This is generally an inverse relationship, and between 2002 and 2007, supply and demand conditions were such that world stocks declined as a proportion of world consumption. These same supply and demand conditions put upwards pressure on prices. In these situations, you generally see a production response from producers and consumer demand weaken. These responses saw stocks increase as a proportion of consumption and also put downward pressure on prices. Presently, world demand is strong, and while production is increasing, it is constrained in many countries. Consequently, stocks are declining as a proportion of consumption and prices are rising. There are no indications yet of sufficiently strong supply and demand responses that will put downward pressure on prices. And while the EU has around 195,000 tonnes of skim milk powder stocks, these are expected to be distributed within the EU by charitable organisations. In the butter market, on the other hand, there is evidence of supply and demand responses to existing high prices, and stocks as a proportion of consumption are forecast to increase. So what does this mean for world prices? ABARES is forecasting that the world price for butter will decrease from its presently higher levels over the medium term as a result of the supply and demand responses. Skim milk powder prices, on the other hand, are forecast to hold firm initially before declining as more export supplies come onto world markets. Cheese prices are forecast to decline over the outlook period. Despite the forecast price declines in the latter part of the outlook period, the prices forecast for the end of the period are all significantly higher than the average prices achieved over the 10 years before the 2007-08 price spike. Now I will summarise the outlook for Australian milk production and prices. Not all of the good news in world prices is translating into the Australian market, partly because of the high value of our dollar. The Australian average farm gate price for milk is forecast to decline in real terms over the outlook period. In nominal terms, it's going to be pretty steady. The real price will average around 38 cents per litre in 2011-12 and decline to around 35 cents in 2015-16. which is a reflection of declining world prices in the latter part of the period. The price forecast has not factored in any influence of the retail pricing strategies being employed by the large supermarket chains that Lee was talking about in his introduction. This is for two reasons. First, it is far from clear how long the present retail pricing strategies for milk are going to be employed. Second, even if these retail pricing strategies are to continue, it is far from clear by how much these might affect the average farm gate price of milk. Any effect would be the product of commercial negotiations and these will be influenced by region-specific considerations. While oil prices are forecast to decline, production, on the other hand, is forecast to gradually increase over most of the outlook period, from a low point in 2009-10 when production reached its lowest level since 1995-96. This increase in milk production will be driven by two things. The first of these influences is the ongoing increase in milk yields per cow, which have been driven by improved herd genetics, advances in pasture management, and increased use of feed grains and forage crops. Over the 10 years to 2009-10, these changes increased yields by 20% to around 5,800 litres per cow. These yield improvements are expected to continue over the outlook period at a similar rate to the previous decade. The second influence is that we're expecting to see dairy cow numbers increase slightly after a decade of decline. This turnaround reflects an assumption of favourable seasonal conditions over the outlook period and an increased availability of irrigation water. After exceptional conditions in 2010, dam storages in the Murray-Darling Basin are presently over 80% for the whole of the basin. There has only been one other time since October 2002 when these storages exceeded 50%. This has resulted in water allocations for 2010-11 in northern Victoria being 100%, which is very good news for dairy farmers in these regions, which account for around 20% of milk production in Australia. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, ABARES is cautiously optimistic about the outlook for world dairy markets and a gradual increase in Australian milk production. World demand is forecast to grow more quickly than production over the early part of the outlook period, providing support for world prices. Australian milk production is forecast to grow gradually over the outlook period as a result of increasing milk yields and a small increase in cow numbers. Thank you very much for your attention.